Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. We are on the Man of God Network, brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. And in this conversation, we're really excited to talk about a particular Baptist that has not gotten much attention, or at least perhaps not as much attention as we would hope for. And our brother, Matt Reynolds, has joined our conversation today to talk about the spirituality of William Ward. So welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned in our introduction here, the Covenant Podcast, exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. And as you know from listening to our show, if you do, we like to accomplish that by looking at Calvinistic Baptists from the past and the way that the Lord has used them to build his church in a tradition that we think is faithful to the scriptures. So in this conversation, we want to talk about William Ward and how the Lord used him and what his life can teach us. But before we jump right into that subject, we want to introduce again Matt Reynolds to our show, and we'll do so by asking you, brother, can you introduce yourself to our audience? And as you do, will you include your interest in studying William Ward?
Sure. So my name is Matt Reynolds, and I'm the husband of Shannon Reynolds, now for 27 years by God's grace, 27 and a half, father of Noel and Hallie Reynolds, ages 20 and 17. And as we would in India, I'll mention my parents' names as well. Son of Marvin and Jeannie Reynolds of Somerset, Kentucky, where I grew up. Did undergrad work in social work at Morehead State University, graduating in 96. Had a few years of normal jobs after that before God called us into vocational ministry in general and overseas missions in particular. That led to time at Southern, working on an MDiv to prepare to go overseas, and finished that degree while overseas. We served, my wife and I, and our youngest daughter first, and our second daughter. We served for 9 years in South Asia with the IMB. And after that, we're back for about 3 years, and then returned for 4.5 years with another sending agency called Pioneers, still in South and Southeast Asia. Toward the end of that time was in leadership, watching over teams in 3 different countries. And along the way, toward the end of there, began work on my PhD on the spirituality of William Ward, in biblical spirituality, but writing on the spirituality of William Ward. And then we returned to the States February 2020 and began serving as executive director of Refuge International at that time.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for that introduction and for taking the time to join us on today's show. It sounds like the Lord has done some incredible work in your life and has taken you to many places in your efforts to serve him well. So we're very excited to hear you talk about another topic that you have some expertise in, and that is the topic of William Ward, particularly his spirituality. And I just wonder if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit more about what led you to study Ward in the first place. You've ultimately allowed your studies to provide an opportunity to write a book on William Ward. And during our time before our discussion, you mentioned how there's not a whole lot of interest in him. So maybe to help facilitate some of that interest, would you be willing to first tell us what led you to study Ward, what led you to write a book about him, and then who do you wish to impact through your writings and your studies on Ward?
Sure. So initially, I was not interested in writing about William Ward. My initial interest was just something Puritan related. I've always loved the Puritans, and they've helped me understand my own conversion, better. And that was the general thought that I brought into things. But then as I got into the program, like so many, all I'd heard of was William Carey. And so I thought, well, I'll write on William Carey. But then it was my advisor, Dr. Michael Haken, who introduced me to William Ward and basically encouraged me to write on him because he was so instrumental in the Serampore mission, in the Serampore trio, but no one had heard of him. And so yeah, it was largely Dr. Haken's suggestion. But as I studied more about William Ward and got to know him, I'm really glad that I was able to write about him even more than William Carey and Joshua Marshman, the other members of the Serampore trio. I think, should I go ahead and comment on the scope of the book and who I had in mind as I wrote?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
We'd love to hear that.
So I guess the reason I focused on the spirituality of William Ward was partly the degree. My degree is a PhD in biblical spirituality. And so those degrees tend to focus either on spirituality, as taught in a biblical text or as illustrated in a particular person, in church history. And so mine's the latter. And the interest, though, in William Ward in particular, and I guess even William Carey, is a bit personal because we served in India, specifically in Kolkata, and Serampore is just 12 miles upriver, up the Hooghly River from Kolkata. And so the place that I was reading about, and of course, I'd already heard of William Carey. I'd already visited Serampore College. I'd visited the archive library, the museum there. I'd seen the artifacts. This was very real to us, and we worshiped in our first term in Carey Baptist Church that was founded by these three in 1809. Later, I would have the privilege of supplying the pulpit there for a year in around 2016, 17. And so it was really kind of dreamlike, really, to be able to research someone and read about his life, 200 years ago, that was doing similar work among similar people, and even recognize street names that he mentioned. It was just really fascinating. So that was kind of the connection, with the missions aspect of what he did and his spirituality. Let me define just a little bit that word spirituality, because I think it's a very popular term these days, and a lot of people you meet would describe themselves as spiritual, even though they might not be particularly religious or devoted to any particular religion. And so I used it, and I think in the program it was used basically to denote someone's piety or how someone lives out his or her faith. And so in the case of William Ward, or Christian spirituality, it's basically how a person lives out his or her faith in Christ Jesus. And so that's really the broad scope of William Ward's work. And in general, in particular, I focused a lot on his theology, the theological background that shaped him, the church history background that shaped him and gave rise to his beliefs, which gave rise to the way he lived his life and went about his role in the Serampore mission. And just briefly to kind of set the backdrop for the biography, I think that I'm supposed to share in just a little bit. It really was the work focuses. It's really kind of an intersection of church history, of theology, and missions. That's really the composition of the work. I mean, it's his spirituality, but it focuses on those three subjects in depth. And so when you think of church history and William Ward, you're looking at the spiritual church history as his spiritual development took place in England, which had been shaped in the immediate past by the Great Awakening, preachers like George Whitefield, John Wesley, and before that by particular Baptist forefathers like John Fawcett at the seminary home where he studied at Ewood Hall, Robert Hall, even John Gill, and before that, his Puritan forefathers. And most notably, the biggest influence on him was probably Jonathan Edwards in America. He influenced the Particular Baptist quite a bit and helped to remove some of the hurdles of high Calvinism that really were impeding missions in that day. And of course, before that, reformers like John Calvin and the Protestant Reformation in general. So really, it's impossible to consider William Ward's spirituality apart from church history. And I guess the most immediate context would have been the high Calvinism of Particular Baptist that really did not see missions as something that was even necessary because of their theological framework. So theology as well. He was from a dissenting, nonconformist background, so that was part of his heritage as well. So he shared kind of a common bond with other dissenters, whether Presbyterian or Congregationalists, that did not feel they could worship in accordance with the dictates of the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England. And he was a Particular Baptist. That was part of his heritage, that as opposed to General Baptist. So they did adhere to the doctrines of grace. They believed those, and as opposed to General Baptist right there in England. And in terms of missions, even though they were pioneers for sure, William Carey's often regarded as the father of modern missions. And so he went in 1793 to India. William Ward and Joshua Hannah Marshman, and others followed in 1799. There was one other that followed midway between, I believe, John Fountain. But they were very much pioneers in their own right. Many in the modern missionary movement in a Protestant sense followed them, but even they built on the shoulders of the Moravians before them. So all of that kind of comes, that's kind of the context that William Ward grew up in and was called to ministry in, called to missions in, and did ministry in.
With that background and that backdrop that you have provided, can you now give us a biographical sketch of William Ward himself?
Sure. And I'll just mention, for those that would want to, let's see, I don't know if I can, if I type a website into this chat, will that show up or no?
No, I don't believe it will.
Okay. Well, I'll just mention it for what it's worth. So, William Carey University in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, maintains a site. It's called the Center for Study of the Life and Work of William Carey. So, no surprise, since that's the name of the school. But on that site, there is significant information about both Joshua Marshman and William Ward. And so, if you go to that site, it's www.wmcarey.edu/Carey, Carey. And then if you add another /WM Ward, then you'll be to the page on William Ward. And they have a nice chronology there, a really detailed chronology that you can view and I believe click on it. It takes you to even more information. But I'll give a brief overview. So William Ward was born October 20th, 1769, and lived to let's see, let me get this date here. Lived to March 7th, 1832. So 1769 to 1832. His life really breaks down into three periods. The first is basically his birth until he went to Serampore, India. That's roughly 1769 to 1799. Then from the arrival in Serampore until the time when Andrew Fuller passed away in 1815. So that period, 1799 to 1815, you could call a period of favor with the Baptist Missionary Society back in England. And then the period of time from 1815, when Andrew Fuller died, until 1823, when William Ward passed, was really a period of controversy or tension with the sending agency back in England. So I'll try to give just a little more detail about each of those. William Ward was not from a Baptist background. We really don't have a lot of information about his religious upbringing, except that he was reared with religious education, largely by his mother. His father, Thomas, was a farmer, and his mother's name was likely Anne Fletcher, but it's not recorded in print. There are records of Ward mentioning his religious upbringing by his mother, but she was a Methodist and not a Baptist. So she sought to give Ward, a godly upbringing. But there's really not a lot more about, not even about his conversion to faith in Christ. It's really just not a lot of information there. But after a basic education, probably around when he was barely a teenager, maybe 13 or 14 years old, he apprenticed under John Drury in printing. And so this was to be his trade, which he took to India, where he printed the Bible, at least portions of it, in over 20 different languages. So he was an editor eventually of the Derby Mercury in Derby, England, where he was born. Later for the Hull Advertiser and Exchange Gazette. And in that day, editors often wrote pieces also. And so Ward had power through his editor position. And he also, kind of being from dissenting stock, he really sympathized with those that were speaking out against the government, that were speaking up for free speech, that lobbied for a free press that could critique the government. And that got him in trouble. And there's, again, not a lot of detail about kind of what caused him to start attending a Baptist church and to start preaching in villages. But it seems like it was, at least in part, a close scare that he had. A piece that he had written for his newspaper was published in a national periodical called the Morning Chronicle. And the editor of that paper was actually put on trial for the article William Ward had written. So that man was acquitted, but it could have gone badly. It could have landed Ward in jail even. And so he just kind of, his work as an activist and a printer just kind of fades into the background. You don't read a lot more about it. But you do see around 1795, Ward becomes involved in a Baptist church on Salthouse Lane. There's some dispute about whether it was at that place or George Street, I think it was, but he was later baptized. Again, not a lot of detail there. 1796, he began preaching in villages there, kind of itinerant preaching. And someone heard of his labors, offered to sponsor him for theological education, and then he went to kind of a home seminary that was led by Reverend John Fawcett at Ewood Hall. And then somewhere along the line, he meets William Carey, and there's just a brief mention of this in the one work, really, that was written. There are a few magazine articles written before my work in the 70s, 1970s, 1980s, by Christopher Smith and Daniel Potts. And apart from that, there's really not much. You have to go all the way back to his memoir that was written by Samuel Stennett in 1825. And his memoirist, Samuel Stennett, surmises that he must have met William Carey. I guess he had heard him mention a meeting with William Carey, and records that William Carey, when he met William Ward, heard about his printing trade and told William Ward that they could use a person of your business to enable us to print the scriptures, and actually expressed his hope to Ward that he would follow him someday. And so fast forward to 1798, 99, a member of the Particular Baptist Missionary Society visited Ewood Hall, and apparently Ward's heart was touched, was stirred, and he was eventually appointed as a missionary through the Particular Baptist Missionary Society in 1799 in May, and just 17 days later set sail for India, and then I think October 1799 landed in Serampore, India. And so that's kind of the first period of his life. The second period, I'll try to be a little more briefer here, but you don't read a lot more about print, his activism per se. A little bit, he did speak up against the practice of widow burning, the Hindu practice of widow burning, sati. He spoke up against that. But really, the legacy that he had in Serampore was one of mission administrator, peacemaker, pastor, mentor. He mentored a lot of the, because he went single, so he was single at first. He eventually married John Fountain's widow, who had gone before him, and he passed away, I believe, shortly after Ward arrived. So he married his widow, Anne, and and he was a mentor to a lot of the children of the missionaries, a lot of the sons of William Carey and Joshua Marshman and others. He, of course, ran the printing press, and in that role, he printed what they called paper missionaries. So their typical work at that time was that they would print these paper missionaries, these tracts. They would go out into the villages surrounding Serampore, and even sometimes take river trips further into the hinterland, and they would preach the gospel and hand out tracts. And of course, initially, a lot of time spent learning language. And the Serampore mission was really funded by the sale of literature, especially when Ward would do print jobs for the East India Company and the government there in Calcutta, and through Joshua Marshman's educational work, and then through William Carey's employment as a professor in the Civil Service College at Fort William. So that continued, roughly up until 1815. And when you read about it, it was just a grueling schedule. I mean, it was in the print shop all week. A community life at the mission, where they held each other accountable. They took church very seriously. Then on the weekends, they were, preaching multiple times a day in English, in Bangla, in Serampore, in Calcutta. You almost get tired reading about it. It was just, and of course, personally, I knew the heat and the mosquitoes and all the things that are part of life there. It was not easy, and but that was and William Ward eventually adopted one child that had been fathered by John Fountain before his death. He adopted him, and they had other children, other daughters after that. And then the period from 1815 on to his death, that's painful to read about just because of the controversy. And that wasn't the focus of my dissertation, so I'm not as well studied about that period of time. But it is painful because unlike today, where you can resolve a conflict more quickly because of email or phone calls, they didn't have that then, and it took months for post to reach England and to receive a reply to India. So half a year or more would go by as they tried to hammer out who had jurisdiction of property. And so that was kind of a sad time when the original rope holders, if you will, began to die off, who knew Carey, Ward, Marshman personally, and basically trusted them. They didn't need documents drawn up in writing about who owned the property and things like that. But after some of those passed away, and especially Andrew Fuller, a new generation rose up that began to question everything, and more junior missionaries that were jealous, really, of Carey, Marshman, and Ward were accusing them. And it's really sad to read about. And eventually Ward, toward the end of his life, makes a trip back to England and even to America to drum up to defend the work that they were doing in Serampore, and also to drum up support for the mission and for the new college that they were trying to start. So that's brief, and maybe even that's too much detail, but that's a little bit about William Ward's biography.
No, thank you for that, brother. That's, I think, exactly what we were looking for. This is the type of material that we are definitely interested in as co-hosts, and I think our audience is too, because to our episodes on obscure Baptists. And so we're thankful that you have taken the time, research information about his life. And we not only want to talk about the details of his life, but we want to, if you will lead us on this, make some applications from William Ward to help us continue to persevere in the faith. So our next question for you is, what does William Ward have to teach us about spirituality? You previously had given us a helpful definition about what spirituality is, but we want to learn now what Ward teaches us about spirituality, and more specifically, what practical lessons can we learn from his life?
Sure. Yeah. In studying William Ward's life, there were four themes or strands of his spirituality that really emerged as prominent. The biggest one was love. And I say this because this was how he was regarded by his colleagues and others that he interacted with in the larger ecumenical circles there in Calcutta and Serampore, and also just the community there in Calcutta. So love, humility, prayer, and usefulness. So these are all prominent themes in his spirituality. As far as practical lessons from his life, I think the thing that stands out really from start to finish is kind of what was his strength is probably the same reason that has been overlooked. So, for example, if you have a David Livingston or a William Carey or even an Adoniram Judson, some of these that are first to go, those make good stories, because they're pioneers. They're the first to go, and in many cases, they had kind of an adventurous spirit, and also, in Judson's case, the suffering that he endured for the sake of the gospel, and just the movie-like drama that took place, in the preservation of that Bible that he translated. With William Ward, though, he is the kind of person that is easily forgotten in history, but at the time that history was being made, you would not have had a Serampore mission without William Ward, because William Ward was the administrator that kept everything running behind the scenes. And we've seen this personally, from being overseas. Sometimes those very bold personalities are also some of the most difficult to get along with. And so I think that was probably the case with Joshua Marshman. Joshua Marshman was, on the one hand, very bold and evangelistic, but on the other hand, very abrasive, ill-mannered even at times, did not make a good name for himself with the British, who were in power and may not have shared his convictions. He would have gotten along well with those that shared his convictions to a T, but he was ready to debate anything with anyone who didn't share those same convictions. Ward, on the other hand, was much more of an Irenic, personality. He sought ways to find common ground. Ward, probably more than any of the others, just really reveled in the fellowship that they had with their Anglican brethren. Early on, Claudius Buchanan, David Brown, these were chaplains in the East India Company that I believe, if I'm remembering rightly, had been appointed by John Newton. So there was a tie even with John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. William Ward actually brought a letter of recommendation from John Newton to introduce themselves, to these brothers in Calcutta. It's fascinating. And William Carey even was mentored, participated in a breakfast group that Newton had back in England before he set sail for India. But they had this really, and this happens a lot on the mission field nowadays too. If you're one of the only Christians in a frontier mission field, you find yourselves willing to fellowship with and even partner with people that maybe in the States you didn't, because you had more of your own specific camp, around you. And so that was certainly the case with Ward. He really, just to give one example, he and Marshman differed on their view of communion. Marshman, and like Andrew Fuller, was more convicted that communion should be closed, which would have meant only Baptists would participate in that communion. Only, but Ward pushed for and enjoyed open communion with these Anglican brothers there in Serampore, and the times of prayer that they shared. Now, as more of the Anglican stripe and more of the Baptist stripe and others began to arrive, you see a lessening of that, later. But initially, Ward was really, just of a very warm-hearted stripe that really paved the way for good relations. He was also, a compromiser in a good way, I'll say, not a compromiser in terms of his faith, but when there were a few different incidents throughout the history of the mission where they fell out of favor with the British East India Company. And of course, the British East India Company could send them home if they wanted to, and or they could make life difficult for them at Serampore. They could seize their printing press, which they did at one time. But Ward was the one, again, that kept his head and found a way forward, and could be tactful in his speech and not alienate the other side. So that's I think just the effect that his life had. Also, the loving aspect, the humble aspect of his personality and his spirituality meant that he was widely well regarded as a pastor and just a friend there in Calcutta, and many of the junior missionaries really owed their own growth in Christ and holding to the faith, to William Ward's influence. So I think that's, maybe I'll just try to wrap up this section and just say that I think he teaches us, he reminds us that some spiritual gifts that are overlooked, like administration, for one, it is in Scripture, it is a spiritual gift. And he reminds us that not many churches, not many missions do very well, or at least don't do well for very long without someone of that gifting. And so I think a study of William Ward and becoming familiar with him is important, because it just it corrects our myopic view of spiritual gifts, even, and reminds us that heroes of the faith are not necessarily the ones with the loudest mouths, all the time. That William Ward has a real place in the heroes of the faith. Also, another thing that really stands out is the value of friendship. because he was a more of a peaceful mind, he had friends, across many friendships across the aisle, so to speak. I mean, in the Anglican camp, in the Baptist camp, he enjoyed a sweet friendship with the Presbyterian captain of the ship that sympathized with them and took them from England to India, and they saw each other at times after that. He enjoyed communion with him on board the Criterion, even while Marshman was hesitant to do that. So the value of friendship, I think, stands out with William Ward, and you see that in the funeral sermons that were preached at his funerals. And just love covers over a multitude of wrongs. I mean, even within the trio, it's remarkable that these three men maintained harmonious relationships over the period of 23 years. I mean, it's remarkable that they stayed alive that long, in that climate in India at that time when other colleagues did not live that long. But I think partially because of the hardships they endured, because they were there together at the founding time of the mission, they just formed inseparable bonds that even personality differences and quirks and foibles didn't separate. And so that's another thing that just stands out, that an effect of his spirituality was that those guys continued to get along and work together and enjoy each other's fellowship over 23 years.
This has been a fascinating discussion on the life, theology, and spirituality of William Ward. And Matt, for those of us like me who are not as familiar with this figure from Baptist history, would you be willing to share any key quotes or excerpts from Ward that illustrate his spirituality? You mentioned 4 strands of spirituality in response to our previous question. Do you have any insights from Ward that you can share to flesh that out for our listeners today?
Sure. Yes, I was looking back to see that there were so many precious quotes, and one, and I will share a couple. One aspect of Ward's personality that really you see more and more as you read his journal, and that was one of the main sources for my dissertation, was his journal that he kept day by day from about 1799 to about 1811. It's the primary source. He sent material from it back to England to Andrew Fuller, who would edit it and then put it in the periodical accounts and then sell subscriptions. But the original source was the journal. And then Daniel Potts, the Australian scholar, transcribed that whole journal, and it's available now on microfilm. One place is the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary Library. The archives of the BMS are on microfilm there, including Potts's transcription of the William Ward's journal. But you really see his personality come out, and he really had a wit about him. And sometimes it was kind of good-natured ribbing of his colleagues, but he was really funny. And so I put an appendix in my dissertation called "The Winsome Wit of Ward," and there's a lot of good quotes there about how it was no big thing to baptize in water that where someone had been swallowed by an alligator, not long before. Just all kinds of crazy stuff. But let me just, this is I'll just read a little bit from my dissertation here, including a quote here. Of all of Ward's spiritual traits, love reigns supreme. As his former Ewood Hall fellow surveyed Ward's letters, he concluded that, and this is a quote, a spirit of Christian love breathed through all his writings and marked all his conversation and demeanor. He was gentle and unassuming, though firm in his sentiments and holding no truth with a loose hand. He was never dogmatical. His disposition was naturally kind. The love of Christ was the predominant affection in his heart, and the glory of God and the good of immortal souls, the great aim of all his actions. And then Ward, concerning his own estimation of love as compared with other doctrines, he counted it the centerpiece of his personal creed. And of course, this is not all that Ward wrote. So you'll hear this and you might think, whoa, where was Ward on the theological map? But this is just one quote, okay? But he says, the doctrines of the love of God, the atonement, the resurrection, and kingdom of Jesus are, I trust, more and more precious to me. My views of them are more consoling, my faith in them more solid, and my peace and joy more regular. Yet I can part with the dogmas of enthusiasts, with the creeds of bigots, with the utmost ease. If I were asked for my creed, I could soon give it. God is love. If God so loved the world, we ought also to love one another. Were I going to establish a church, I would have such a creed as this. So, again, he was not quite as particular as Marshman, but really majored on the love of God in Christ. So those are just a couple of quotes.
Matt, we truly appreciate all that you've shared with us about William Ward and his life, his spirituality, and really just the encouragement that his life and ministry really ought to give to all of us. With that being said, what final encouragements do you have related to Baptist history, William Ward in particular, or anything else that you would like to share with us and our audience?
Yeah, if Lord willing, this book's going to be published by H&amp, publisher in Canada. It's I'm not sure exactly when that's going to be. There's still some edits being made, but when it comes out, I encourage you to read it. I think that William Ward is worthy of reading, and for those that have an interest in diving a little deeper. We do live in a special age, being the digital age. Many original works, and I'm talking about letters, journals, funeral sermons. It's amazing how much from 200 years ago is available on Google Books. You can access it. You can read about it, and reading the letters and sermons from that time period, you just it's refreshing to see how deeply they thought, how thoroughly and perspicuously they expressed their convictions, and even in correspondence, how warm was the correspondence between grown men, for example. And, I just came away realizing that we just don't see that. We don't have that kind of correspondence anymore in emails, for example. It's almost like the medium has changed the discourse as well. And I guess just a general encouragement to check out works like that. There really aren't a lot of others about William Ward, except that you can find his memoir by Samuel Stennett, The Life of William Ward. You can find another key work on Google Books that otherwise is you have to go to Serampore to purchase it, but it is available online, Google Books, The Life and Times of Carey, Marshman, and Ward. That also is a great, one of the earliest works regarding the Serampore mission, and talks a lot about William Ward. There's a need to rediscover those, and also just to be mindful that at any period in church history, God's working not only in the big heroes we've heard of, but in silent and maybe more quiet guys like William Ward that we haven't heard of.
Amen. We have been speaking with Matt Reynolds about the spirituality of William Ward and the work that he has written and will at some point in time be published by H&amp. I encourage you and my co-host encourage you when it is published to go pick it up and read it, as we likely will. Again, Matt, thank you for coming on the Covenant Podcast.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, we wish you grace and peace.